Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Unfortunately, I was unable to travel for this event, but I am thrilled to be able to join remotely. Before proceeding to the panel discussion, I'm going to be setting the stage by talking a little bit about the current trends on greening transportation, and I want to start that by discussing how data and modeling fit into an effective policymaking framework. Accurate data collection and the proper handling and analysis of this data is essential if we wish to minimize compromising public decisions. In fact, in many ways, data is the backbone that enables us to define and implement effective policies of any kind. And when I think about implementing effective policies, there are three key components in very broad terms that are essential. First, at the onset, it is critical to clearly define the intended aim of any policy and to understand what you are hoping to achieve with their implementation. You also need to consider how effectiveness or success can be measured or quantified. And finally, once policies have been implemented, you need to actually analyze whether the intended goals were achieved. Without these three key steps, I would argue, you cannot have effective policies. Because even if the policy has had positive outcomes associated with its implementation, it would be impossible to say that the policy was effective at delivering those outcomes because you didn't know what you were trying to achieve in the first place. So, within effective policymaking, where does data come in? The answer, as you can imagine, is everywhere. Data allows us to understand existing issues, and it helps us define the policy challenges that we're facing. Additionally, when defining policy goals, it is critical to define what data is needed to quantify any potential impacts before they are implemented. You also need data when you're considering different policy alternatives. And finally, of course, data is critical for ex post analysis to understand the impacts of any implemented policies. But collecting, managing, and using data can be quite complex. And as all of us who work with data and want to see more evidence based policy know, we need to be very, very strategic when we collect our data because data collection can be both cost and time consuming, and different models require different types of data. Additionally, when we try to do analysis at all scales, but this is particularly clear at the global scale, what we often find is that there is no comprehensive data. And the data that is out there tends to be decentralized with unclear oversight spread across different departments, units, and ministries, not to mention privately held data, which is very difficult to access. To make matters worse, when the data is collected, it's often not harmonized. There are no standard definitions, and what we find is that they're often bundled in unclear ways, which makes using them effectively much more difficult. However, this does not mean that it is impossible to do high quality, quantitative based analysis. Keeping with the theme of our session on greening transport, I'm now going to quickly go over some of the results from our most recent ITF Transport Outlook, where we take a very quantitative based approach to understanding the impacts of decarbonization strategies and the implementation of different types of policies in the hopes of better understanding whether current policies have been effective or are likely to be effective at decarbonizing transport. Our results show that the transport sector is not decarbonizing fast enough, but this is hardly news. As a sector, we have known this to be the case for a number of years now. However, there is still hope. And I know it can be easy to stand on the sidelines and simply say, just do more, do it faster. But what's critical for this, and what we've tried to do here, is identify what we should do more of and where we should do more of this and why it matters what these policies are for these different things at these different places. The truth is that different sectors have different needs, and they are advancing at different rates in terms of their decarbonization. As this graph shows, it is critical for us to give much more focus to freight transport because although policies are making some inroads in decreasing passenger emissions, freight emissions continue to grow and are expected to continue to grow unless new policies are implemented at a much faster rate. Additionally, we need to understand that we need different solutions and different policies at different geographic scales. If we look at the modal shares at different distance scales or bands, what we see is that the results vary quite a bit, with aircraft dominating very long distance passenger travel while playing a much smaller role in shorter distance travel. Similarly, for freight transport, the ton kilometer distributions vary between the different distance bands. For instance, while at the urban levels, most activity is tied to lorries and trucks, at very long distances, transport demand is dominated by the maritime sector. And the impacts in terms of emissions are quite different. And what they highlight is how differently the challenges are for these different modes and for these different ways of travel. It seems clear that cleaner vehicle fleets and fuels are an essential part of any decarbonization solution. However, there will still be road vehicles and ships and planes under any low carbon scenario. But what's very important here is that these vehicles must be the most efficient and the least polluting vehicles, vessels, and aircrafts if we wish to break the link between activity and emissions. It is critical for there to be targets for cleaner fleets and fuels, and crucially, that these targets be met worldwide. And this discussion of cleaner fleets highlights another critical aspect for effective policies: anticipating and measuring direct and indirect effects of policy implementation. For instance, if we anticipate there is going to be a higher uptake of zero emission vehicles by 2050 as part of these cleaner fleets, this is likely to have a significant impact on global tax revenues, as fuel taxes in particular would reduce greatly. And while the impacts would be felt everywhere, some regions are much more likely to be impacted to a greater extent than others. And again, the important point here is not necessarily the regions that will be most impacted, which is of course very important. But for the discussion today, what I wish to highlight is the need to take a broad view when considering how we measure the impacts of policies, and to understand that to achieve broader goals, good policies in one area need to be complemented with good policies in other sectors. In this case, good transport policy should be tied to good tax policies that anticipate the effect that a greener fleet would have on revenues. Thank you very much for the attention, and I wish you all a productive rest of the day.